we're going to look at the theological possibility of this being quasi-heavenly, as it seems, okay, specially related to God, given authority. We're going to look at that now and see how Jesus applies that term to himself, and we're going to begin in chapter 8 of John's Gospel. I'm at verse 28. So Jesus said, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own authority, but speak thus as the Father taught me." So he calls himself the Son of Man at this point. To be lifted up, of course, means to be lifted up in John's sense, both on the cross, but also in glory. For John, it is one huge event. Garden, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, one huge act of Father glorifying the Son. Okay? But here, the Son identifies himself as the Son of Man. When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all things to myself, he says later on in John's Gospel. So here, when I am lifted up, you will know that I am he. And that I am he is very, very close to calling himself God. It isn't quite there, but it's teetering on the brink. So we have that use. Now we will also have John chapter 9. We've seen the man born blind just a few minutes ago. We're going to look slightly differently now, toward the end of this story. I'll begin at verse 30. 30, I'm sorry. The blind man answered, "Why, this is a marvel. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard of anyone having his eyes opened who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and you would teach us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him. It is he who speaks to you." And he said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Okay, so definitely Jesus' understanding of himself as this heavenly figure authorized by God to bring kingdom to the world. Last place in John's Gospel we're going to look at is chapter 12. I'll begin at verse 20. Now those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said to him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew went with Philip, and they told Jesus. And Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Okay, now, the Son of Man, Jesus, is to be glorified. Here he is, this great figure that is bringing peace and reconciliation to the world, but through his death. So you can see that in Jesus' understanding, the way it's presented in the Gospels, there's a mixture of glory and authority on the one hand, suffering and death on the other. And they have to go together. This is the way Jesus understands titles. Okay? He rejects, by the way, in many, many places in the Gospel, he rejects the title Messiah, which is one reason I don't feel like playing with it. Instead, he refers to himself as the Son of Man. And people are confused. People are confused. Now, I need to come back to that point of confusion. Continue in verse 12, in chapter 12, pardon me, where we were. Verse 31. Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the ruler of this world be cast out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all things to myself. And he said this to show by what death he was to die. And the crowd answered him, We've heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? So the people don't really understand the title, okay? They don't have a sense of it. That's useful for me, okay? We think too easily that we know who the Son of Man is because it's Jesus and he's a glorified figure. We forget that in the first century, people didn't have a lock on that idea. They weren't 100% clear that it was a figure at all, but it's some title that Jesus gives himself, so they get confused. It's one of the reasons why I really like an alternative translation to the phrase Son of Man. Now this comes out of feminist theology and everything else, but nevertheless, the feminists would rather translate that phrase, the human one. Okay? Why is that useful? Well, to me, because as soon as I hear it, I say, what in the world does that mean? Human one? What's that supposed to mean? But that's exactly the reaction that people had in the first century when Jesus used this term about himself. So what I like about it is that it puts us into the context of the first century rather than us thinking, well, we got it in our hip pocket, we know what this is all about, even though people at that time didn't. So it becomes useful that way to understand, okay, now it makes us probe the mystery of Jesus more deeply because now we have to explore some of the implications of it. Who are you? What are you talking about really? What are you saying to us really, Jesus? It's interesting to me also that there is virtually no use outside the Gospels of the title Son of Man. He's referred to once in one of the speeches of the Acts of the Apostles. After that, that term is never used again. So it's something that I think the disciples themselves didn't get a grip on too well. They didn't really figure it out 100%. Paul never uses it. Never uses it. The allusion, there's one other allusion, and that is, and it's much more borrowing the language of Ezekiel than anything else in the book of Revelation. After the letters to the 7 churches, one like a son of man appears and says to John, the visionary, come up here and write down what you see. Okay, so it's an interesting kind of a title. Very elusive, very, very evocative, very challenging. Who are you really, Jesus? Who are you really? That's another reason why I like Jesus Christ Superstar a great deal, textually speaking. Well, musically too, because it affects, I think, it establishes the sense of a pre-resurrection awareness, okay? So that when Peter, for example, denies Jesus that third time, Mary Magdalene somehow appears in the scene and says, Peter, don't you know what you have done? What you said, you've gone and cut him dead. And he says, I had to do it, don't you see, or else they'd go for me. And she responds, beautifully, I think. It's what he told us you would do. I wonder how he knew. You know? So there's that sense of what's going on really. We don't understand. And that's okay, because that's where people were at that time. Obviously, we can't have in the gospel story examples of resurrection faith that really occurred until after the resurrection. Okay? In the meantime, people are challenged, they are intrigued, they are drawn to him, repelled by him some, okay? Confused by him. You can't ignore him. You can't ignore him. Okay, let's look at a couple of other titles for Jesus. We're going to look at Son. And I want to go to Mark chapter 13. Everybody's at Mark chapter 13, verse 32. After Jesus is predicting all the dire events that are going to accompany both the destruction of Jerusalem and then later on the end of the world, he says, but of that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Take heed and watch, for you do not know the time when it will come. Okay, that's important for us, okay? That's important for us because we have to now try to unpack the use of the term Son in the New Testament, in the Gospels particularly, okay? The one thing we have to understand is that when we talk about Jesus as the Son of God, we're talking out of a context of 6 centuries of post-resurrection meditation and theology and creeds and councils. And when we confess one Lord and one Son, Jesus Christ, that is not what the Scriptures in the gospel context meant, okay? What we're talking about in the creeds is a much more advanced and developed notion. Now, it starts from here, okay? And there's a continuity, and this is important, but they aren't the same just yet, okay? They aren't the same just yet. It's for that reason, for example, that I think it was in the Psalm for Ash Wednesday when we were singing it. In our text, in Journey Songs, Holy Spirit, please, your Holy Spirit, take not from me. Okay, it was Psalm 51. Holy Spirit was capitalized, capital H, capital S. And certainly that was not the sense of the psalmist. They had no clue about anything like a Holy Trinity. Okay? So we have to be careful that we don't retroject too much back into a gospel context that doesn't belong there. Okay? We keep continuity and development, but we have to keep an understanding of where we are and where we start. So when the term Son is used in the New Testament by Jesus and by others with regard to Jesus, most classically the centurion, after the crucifixion, truly this man was the Son of God. You know? Again, they're not confessing something that we would understand with Trinitarian theology at that point. What are they talking about? Son as obedient. Son as obedient. Throughout, especially John's Gospel, we get phrases like, I can only do what I see the Father doing. The Father is at work at now, therefore I am at work right now. I've come to do not my will, but the will of him who sent me. Whoever receives you receives me, who receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. Okay? The Father is greater than I. I've come to do his will. So, the thrust of sonship in the gospel portions, the pre-resurrection gospel portions that we're talking about here, that emphasis is on the Son as obedient. Okay? The Son as obedient. And therefore, a Son who suffers. Therefore, a Son who suffers.